Today we'll be learning how to multiply radicals. We learned first how to take one radical and simplifying it by finding the biggest perfect square that fit into it. Then we learned how to combine radicals that are the same by adding or subtracting them. And today we're going to learn how to take different radicals and multiply them. So in this first example, I have radical 6, or the square root of 6, times radical 2, or the square root of 2. So the first thing I want you to get into the habit of doing is anytime that you're multiplying, or even if you're adding or subtracting different square roots or different radicals, when there is no number outside of the radical sign, go ahead and just add a 1 next to it so that you minimize the amount of errors that you make moving forward. So if there's not a number next to the radical, just add a 1, put a 1 next to it so that you can do the next step. The next thing I want you to do is, once you have your radicals and your square roots set up, is I am going to multiply the things that are the same one at a time. So first I'm going to rearrange this. I'm going to first take the numbers that are outside of the radicals, my coefficients, including their signs. So if it's a negative, if it's a minus, it's a negative. If it's a plus, it's a positive number. I'm going to take those two numbers and I'm going to put them down first. I have 1 times 1. Then I'm going to take the radicals, whether they are different or the same, doesn't matter, and then I'm going to write those down next. So I have 1 times 1, and then I have radical 6 times radical 2. And the reason why I can do this is because when multiplication is commutative, meaning that if I have 2 times 4, for example, well, that's the same thing as 4 times 2. Or if I have 2 times 4 times 6, well, that's the same thing as 6 times 4 times 2, or 2 times 4 times 6. I can rearrange those numbers in different ways, and it'll still give me the same exact answer. So I can take these radicals and I can rearrange them so that I put the numbers outside of the radical first and then my square roots after. And now I can multiply the things that come from the same type of term. So first I'm going to take the numbers outside of the radical. 1 times 1 just gives me 1. And then I'm going to multiply what's inside of the radicals. And when we're multiplying, the numbers inside the radicals do not have to be the same. I know that I said when we're adding or when we're subtracting, you can only add and subtract the things that have the same last name. But when we're multiplying, we can actually multiply anything as long as both of those numbers are under the radical. So 6 times 2 gives me 12. So this piece is actually going to turn into the square root of 12. So radical 6 times radical 2 is actually equal to 1 square root 12, which is just the same thing as the square root of 12. All I did was multiply what's outside of the radicals, the 1 and the other 1, that gave me 1, and then multiply what's inside of the square roots, the 6 and the 2, to give me 12. So we're gonna apply that same idea here in example 2. In example 2 we have 2 square root of 5 times 7 radical 3. And notice that I'm using the words radicals and square root interchangeably because they both mean the same thing. So again, I'm going to take the numbers that are outside of my radical and I'm going to write those down first. So I have 2 times 7 times, now I'm going to take my radicals and write those down next. So I have 2 times 7 times the square root of 5 times the square root of 3. So when I do 2 times 7, that gives me 14. And when I do radical 5 times radical 3, well, that gives me the square root of 5 times 3 is 15. So that's my answer. That means that 2 square root of 5 times 7 square root of 3 is just simply 14 square root of 15. Okay, now I'm going to do the third example. In the third example, we have parentheses, which a lot of you guys had questions about in your previous lesson. I have radical 2 parentheses 3 square root 5 plus the square root of 2. Okay, so remember I told you in the first step, anytime you see a square root or a radical without a number next to it, just put a 1 there so that you know that there's a 1 outside of that radical, even though we don't usually write it, right? So it's just so you remember, anytime I see an x, I know there's always a 1 next to it. Well, it's the same thing with a radical. Or if I see a negative x, well, that's the same thing as a negative 1x. So if I see a square root, just like I saw square root of 2 here, without a number outside, I'm going to first just put a 1 next to it. Now, if you go back to when we introduced parentheses in our lessons, remember that in order, the only way that I can get rid of any parentheses is by distributing whatever it's outside of my parentheses. So anytime that I see distribution, I know that I have to take whatever this is, whatever it's outside of my parentheses, including its sign. So if it's positive, if it's plus is a positive, if it's minus is a negative. And I have to distribute it to every single thing that's inside of my parentheses here. Okay? So when I do that, first thing I have is I have 1 square root 2 times 3 square root 5. Then I'm going to go ahead and put that plus sign. I'm going to bring that plus sign down. So I have 1 square root 2 times 3 square root 5 plus, again, 1 square root 2, because I'm taking this, what's outside of the parentheses, and distributing it again, times the square root of 2. Now all we have to do is basically apply what we did in examples 1 and 2 times. We're going to apply it once to this over here, and then we're going to apply it another time for this over here. So once again, I take what's outside of my parentheses. First I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this over here. So I'm going to take what's outside of my parentheses. So I have 1 and 3. So that's 1 times 3. And then I'm going to take what's outside of the parentheses. So that's radical 2 and radical 5. So square root of 2 times square root of 5. Again, I bring down my plus sign. And I'm going to do the same thing over here. So I have a 1 and a 1 that I forgot to write down before. So that's 1 times 1. And then I have square root of 2 times the square root of 2. So all I did was rearrange my multiplication so that I have the things outside in one space and the things and the radicals next to that in another space. And now we just simplify. So 1 times 1 is going to give me 3, and that looks like an 8. And radical 2 times radical 5 is going to give me the square root of 10. I bring down my plus sign. 1 times 1 gives me 1, and the square root of 2 times the square root of 2 gives me 4, and that's my answer. Now, just a few notes to help you during your task. Sometimes you might see something like 3 square root 5 times 6, for example, where there's no radical here. So when I rearrange them, that's 3 times 6 times 5. If there's nothing that I can multiply this with, then just like when we're doing combining like terms, then all you have to do is bring it down. So this would just be 3 times 6, which is 18, and you bring down your square root 5. Or for example, I have the square root of 6 times 2, for example. When you're like, well, I don't really have another 2 to multiply anything with, but remember there's always a 1. So this would be 1 times 2, and you just bring down your 6. So those are just a few tips. Also remember, if I have something like, for example, negative 3, I don't know, then remember there's a negative 1 out here, and that number will be multiplied by whatever other number outside of another radical it's being multiplied with. Okay, so just remember, when you're multiplying, you multiply the numbers outside of the radical together, and then you multiply whatever's inside of the radicals on their own. And if you see any parentheses, well, you have to distribute and take it step by step, break it down into different pieces until you get to your final answer.